with the session, please. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's live webinar. This is the Peer Perspectives Unmasking Lessons Learned from COVID-19. This session is being brought to you by Dewpoint in partnership with Rapid7, and we've got a great host or collection of panelists. On today's session with me is Dave Wagner, Trent Carpenter, Mark Shuilling, and Scot King. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, but before that, let me introduce myself and give a little bit of housekeeping to today's session. So my name is Paul Doyle. I'm a sales executive with Dewpoint, based in West Michigan. And today's session is being recorded. So we will, following the conclusion of the session, follow up with everyone to provide access to that recording. Additionally, all attendees' microphones are going to be muted. If you have questions or if you'd like to get something perspective addressed or clarified, please use the chat window. I will be monitoring that and have the opportunity to introduce those questions as we go. Today's session is really intended to be a conversation from practitioners, sharing and learning from each other. We have a series of questions designed for the session that is going to follow the arc of the story of this experience, but we're not going to stick strictly to that script. We're going to allow the panelists to take things where they want to go. Our goal is to get through the entire discussion and wrap up on time by 12:30 Eastern. All right. With that, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, talk about the company or the organization that they are working for, their role, the size and some of the features of the organization that they're a part of before we launch into our discussion today. All right. So I'm going to begin with Dave, follow up with, or secondly with Trent. Third would be Mark, and then Scott, you get to back clean up on the intros, okay? So Dave, take it away, please.
Good morning. I'm Dave Wagner. I'm the IT security manager for the Farm Bureau family of companies. I manage a team that's responsible for identity management, security engineering, security compliance, incident response. We protect around 3,000 users in approximately 400 offices spread primarily across the state of Michigan.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Trent, if you would honor us with going next, please.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Trent Carpenter. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Sparrow Health Systems. Sparrow Health is a mid-Michigan health organization with 5 hospitals spread across mid-Michigan. We have about 10,000 active users, both caregivers as well as contracted help. And I've been with Sparrow about 10 years now.
Thank you, Trent. Okay, Mark, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Shuilling. I am the Chief Technology Officer for Wildfire Credit Union. Wildfire Credit Union is a member-owned, not-for-profit, full-service financial institution. We are headquartered in Saginaw, Michigan, and we operate 5 branches in the Great Lakes Bay region. We serve roughly 50,000 members, and our membership does cover the state of Michigan, with most of our membership being in the Great Lakes Bay region, though. About 900 million in assets and about 170 employees that we support. I oversee all of the technology for the credit union and everything that encompasses.
Great, thank you, Mark. Last but not least, Scott.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I am Scot King. I am responsible for a advisory consulting business at Rapid7. I've been working in the cybersecurity space for about 20 years now. I got my start working in DoD environments, classified networks, doing all kinds of fun things, working with government and different organizations along the way. Just prior to Rapid7, I was the CISO at a Fortune 250 energy company in Southern California. Had a lot of great experiences there. We had a really large program, and I've been with Rapid7 for 3 years. My primary focus is having conversations like this and just kind of really helping advance the thinking and the philosophy around cybersecurity as a profession. And, just really happy to be here today and help contribute back into this conversation.
Thanks, Scott. All right, attendees. So the arc of the story is really 3 phases. There's the then, the now, and the next. So I want to begin by reminding everyone that 90 days ago, our thoughts were on very different topics. I can speak for Dewpoint. We were very excited because we were getting ready to hold our March Madness event, the kickoff for the basketball tournament. We were conscious of all the things that were going to happen because of that event. And so I'm going to ask the panelists to go back 90 days and talk a little bit about what was top of mind for them. What was the biggest challenge? What was the biggest opportunity? Where were they mentally, and where was their organization? And to get this rolling, because I think it's pretty interesting, Trent, I'm going to ask you to begin because we warmed up on this and you told a fascinating story.
Sure. So about 90 days ago, I mean, we as a health system were starting already the pandemic surge plan just because of hearing of the other things, but wasn't really focused at all on remote access for caregivers or employees to be able to work remotely. Really, our focus was more so on the upcoming HIMSS conference, which was for IT and healthcare, as well as the March Madness planning. Part of it is just capacity planning to see what impacts may happen on networks or that type of a thing. So obviously we were dealing with our regular day-to-day phishing, responding, protecting from ransomware, that type of a thing. But it did definitely become a quick realization that things were different when they canceled the entire HIMSS conference. And then also with that, as we're monitoring the Michigan basketball game during the Big Ten tournament, obviously it's a local game, expecting, people to be on there, and then them canceling it as they're on the court. All of a sudden that does really change things to realize, okay, this is bigger than just, hey, people are having it around the world. We're not seeing it to where everything's canceled.
Yep.
So.
Fascinating. To be worried about supporting people watching the tournament to what we have today. Dave, how about you next? Because, this was an interesting kind of transition for you.
Well, unlike Trent, I wasn't really focused on the whole March Madness thing. Though I am a huge sports fan, most people who know me know this because that's my thing. So I was seriously rooting for the Detroit Tigers to take home Stanley's Cup. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see that. But we had big plans for the year. We were focused on improving network segmentation throughout our organization, both workstation-based, server-based, primarily in our virtual environments, as well as taking a good look at gaps around the new Michigan data security laws. So we were planning to move forward there. We were keeping a close tab on how things were going, and I think we saw the writing on the wall as the whole pandemic kind of kicked off. So we kind of gradually morphed away from these big plans into, okay, what are we going to do now?
Okay. And Mark, how about you?
Yeah, so we were working, interestingly enough, our big strategic objective was to find ways to support our membership as well as our employees in a more digital first environment so that we could limit our dependency upon branches. So as we are working through that strategic objective, this all started coming down. Of course, we didn't have time to get it all in place. It sure would have been nice to have done that a year ago for sure. So yeah, as the pandemic kind of started spreading across, I had sort of an interesting perspective. One of my employees had a adult child that was working in China, actually very near the Wuhan province, and was giving us some regular updates as to what was going on. So you could tell that this was different and that something was going to happen as the more news came out and then as things kind of progressed. And so that was really kind of a interesting development there as we started hearing it coming into the United States. And so you kind of start seeing the writing on the wall there that something was going to happen and that we were going to need to take some steps to address it.
Thanks, Mark. So Trent mentioned a big event. I was supposed to be at South by Southwest, and Scott, there were two sort of seminal contextual events that anchored this for you when we were talking about this beforehand. You want to speak to those for a minute?
Yeah, definitely. You know, I've always kind of been, just on a personal level, a planner, paying attention to world events and just thinking about how those things could manifest and understand business continuity, resumption, and how whatever I was responsible for would play into world events. And what really kind of was striking to me when this thing first started going was when the NBA canceled their season. I was watching the news and the NBA just canceled their season, and I was like, wait a second, like this is pretty significant. But I think what really hit home for me specifically was I was at the RSA conference. I went there for a very specific reason, obviously to see some of the activities. I also attended something that was really important to me, which was a remembrance for a close friend that passed away, unfortunately, last year. There was a remembrance at the event for him. And when I got home, you know, I kept thinking to myself, I wonder if the coronavirus, I wonder if COVID was at RSA. You know, I know the city said it was safe to be there and all these other things. Of course they did. And then we found out just a week after that or 2 weeks after that, that some members of our profession from one of the vendor companies, Exabeam, it was announced that they had contracted COVID and were at the RSA show, and they don't necessarily know how they got it. And I think that for me was kind of that tangential note or moment where this became real for everybody in a very substantial way, because there was a lot of us at that conference this year.
Yeah, and I'm going to indulge myself a little bit because Michael Asante was a friend as well, and a tremendous loss. And I think that really puts all of this into perspective. On one end, we're thinking about the inconveniences and the entertainment impact with NBA or Big Ten tournament. On the other end, you know, important people are being affected. Michael's was a battle with cancer for many years. But we're seeing a lot of other people being impacted in the near term, and that puts things much more real and grounded. I want to take it to the next transition, which is we found this was hitting us very quickly, I suspect. For each of your organizations, how fast was that transition? And you know, was it overnight, over the week, over a couple of weeks? Dave, I'm going to ask you to speak to that first, please.
Sure. It started out gradually a couple of weeks before the governor put her executive order into place. You saw more and more people beginning to work from home. And then it just amplified. It sped up quickly. Within 2 weeks, a huge percentage of the organization was already working from home. One good thing with us is that years back we had standardized on laptops for our users, so they could easily pick up their device and take it home. We also had a large pre-existing virtual desktop environment that people were used to using so that they could remote in easily and gain access to all the services they would have had when they were on site. And we also have been moving more into the cloud world with things like Office 365, so that really helped with that transition. One other thing that we did was our desktop support team quickly put together a series of fun and entertaining and educational videos to help our users take their equipment, dismantle it in the office, pack it up, take it home, reset it back up. And that turned out being very effective and beneficial.
So Dave, how many people are still working in company spaces and how many are home? What's the ratio look like?
So Right now, we have about 85 to 90% of our users working from home. It's been very successful. Part of that is attributed to the fact that we had a limited work from home program before this ever happened. So we were already moving into that space. And then, like I mentioned, that whole virtual desktop environment. We've identified about 10% of our roles that just cannot work remotely. And so those individuals are still in the office performing those duties.
Okay, so your organization was leaning in a little bit beforehand in terms of supporting remote work. I'm going to jump over to somewhat of an opposite end of that spectrum. Mark, do you want to speak a little bit to what was going on? Yes, you mentioned in the earlier comments that you were trying to assist members and those that want to do their financial banking and financial service access remotely. What about the organization itself and its preparedness to support remote work?
Right. Well, yeah, we, leading into this, we had very limited number of employees that did work from home. We have a couple of staff that are permanently off-site, and the IT group was used to working remote. But as far as the rest of the organization goes, it was largely done in the office. And so as this transitioned, it was about a couple of weeks before the governor issued her stay-at-home order when we started talking about how we need to get some resilience into the departments, and we started sending some people home. And my staff, they did a great job of getting our remote setup in place. We just kind of had to expand upon what we already had done. The foundation was there. We just hadn't done it at scale. So my operations group, they took our standard remote images, imaged a bunch of devices, did the individual training for everybody as they went off site with instructions so that they could take the equipment, pack it up, take it home, get it set up. And that process ultimately, I think, took about two to 3 weeks for us to get through, where we pushed people off site then. And we also used a sort of a virtual desktop environment so that when they did get off site, they could then RDP into a workstation with all of the normal applications and access that they would normally have had. So it wasn't too disruptive. Ultimately, it was a little bit stressful on the IT group, but it went quite well, and we were able to pull it off, and our infrastructure held up.
That's great. So sounds like the vast majority of your personnel have stayed in a more traditional working situation, with some minority of those working remotely. But for both of you, work didn't really change much. The work that was being performed, the nature of the business that you're in didn't change a lot. That's not true for you, is it, Trent? Right? A lot changed for your world, didn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, initially we did have a few departments, power users that did work remotely. Most employees had limited access to be able to get to some small resources, but you can imagine, as a healthcare system, most of our staff is on premise. Obviously, we're there to care for the patients and everything. So we had large groups that had not really had a work from remote solution in place. And fortunately for us, and part of it was preparing for guests and patients and others to be able to use bandwidth, we did increase our internet bandwidth prior to the COVID piece, which was helpful. But one of the things we ran into was the back-end infrastructure from a hardware support standpoint, as well as licensing, where we hadn't had that licensing in place prior. So fortunately, we were able to use our colo place to bring up new Citrix servers, be able to implement more of the virtual desktop for other groups. Where we did, so kind of preparing for it, before the governor's announcement, we did start to have those that were already doing remote work start to work more remotely. But as Dave mentioned, we saw ours increase very significantly after that, really that first weekend after the governor And probably within about 2 weeks, we had almost all of our non-clinical staff able to work remotely. In that scenario, what was very helpful for us is we'd already had our pandemic flu plan in place. We were working it from a hospital system standpoint, but it made it more streamlined for us to be able to get decisions made, to be able to identify priorities as to which ones need to be remote, how quickly. And then we set up a dedicated team, both from HR, Incident Command, IT, to manage and support those individuals. Part of it was a technology piece, trying to do the technology lift. We did not have every individual that had like a laptop for remote access. So in some cases it was provisioning new, or it was making sure that the systems they had available, that we'd be able to support it. But by creating that Tiger team to do that facilitation, it took that load off of our help desk and others so that we could focus on that and train our workforce right on the spot. So we kind of staged it. Within a day, we had multiple phases where this department would go, and then 2 hours later, next department, and we'd have that communication line open for everybody to raise any issues and communicate.
So that communication internally between people was a big factor. And I'm going to hold off on transitioning to you for just a second, Scott. There was something else that you talked about when we were warming up for this, and that had to do with what was permitted and what became permissible with the new circumstances.
Yeah, so traditionally we have very limited remote access for most of our caregivers. It's something where we have published applications through a Citrix environment, and you can only run those published apps. We did trying to enable our workforce to be able to do more remotely, elevate in some cases the level of the remote access. One of the unique challenges we have, though, is we actually have the opposite too, where we're also having to onboard a lot of outside individuals as part of our surge plan for the hospital and bringing them into the system. And so in that case, we're actually adding more people on-prem while we're also trying to move more people off the network or be able to work remotely.
Interesting.
Yeah, fascinating, sort of being pulled in opposite directions simultaneously. Scott, you work with a lot of different businesses in a lot of different industries, and you can give a little bit more of a cross section. What are you hearing from your customers and the challenges they're facing or the experiences that they've had?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's kind of all over the board, right? I mean, what Dave, Mark, and Trent all talked about, I've heard some really great stories just along the lines of how much effort and energy went in from an IT perspective to enable the remote workforce in a very expeditious way. Some businesses have been affected and industries have been affected in ways, kind of beyond this, right? So some of the conversations I've been having lately have been with companies in the manufacturing space, and they've really struggled quite a bit just across the board, not necessarily from an office worker perspective, but more from a support of the industrial control aspect of their businesses. So how do they keep the production line moving? A lot of these businesses are essential businesses for our nation and our country. How do they keep their workforce? How do they keep the technology that supports manufacturing operations up and operational, knowing that they can't have the same type of on-premise support that they normally do? Because in those types of industries, there is a fair amount of work that goes into the technology behind the scenes, whether it's process control systems or just commodity server workstation infrastructure hardware that supports everything from critical infrastructure that provides power and energy to us or to different businesses, all the way into manufacturing operations. So I'd say from that perspective, it's been really interesting talking about different strategies for allowing remote access, where traditionally remote access has not been permitted in significant ways due to obviously threat landscape issues for manufacturing or for critical infrastructure in other areas. I'd say probably, the businesses like Rapid7, we have a very remote nature of our workforce. And for us, it was really easy to pivot to everybody working remote because all of our apps are published via SaaS solutions, and everything is essentially, all published through an Okta tile. And a lot of businesses are in a similar state. But I think one of the most striking things that has resonated most loudly with me and just talking to different security leaders in different industries is it's not so much the technology transition that has been hardest for their workforce, it's the lack of that personal interaction with other people. And I think that for many of us, where we've been more traditionally in an office environment, we've been able to have hallway conversations, we've been able to, chat at lunch or over coffee. The lack of being able to do that has required people to be much more deliberate and practical in how they're interfacing with their coworkers and how they're collaborating and teaming on everything from projects to, just kind of different normal day-to-day operations. That I think is probably the most salient point that I've heard people are struggling with more so than anything in the technology stack.
So one of the things that I've been reading a lot about is that in times of crisis, when many people find ways to collaborate, come together, there unfortunately are still those who seek advantage for themselves. The nefarious parties don't stop. In fact, they increase their efforts. More porous networks, much greater surface area that all of you are trying to protect. Scott, from a threat analysis standpoint and from a threat vector standpoint, are you guys seeing a lot of activity? Are you seeing new attack vectors?
Yeah, I mean, most of what we're seeing and most of what the organizations that we interface with are seeing are traditional kind of attack methodologies that are being amplified in different ways. So, remote workers tend to have less kind of cognitive necessarily ability to kind of pay attention to things that would be important inside the office environment. So like in an office environment, you're going to have reminders posted on bulletin boards of, watch out for phishing, don't click on links, all that kind of stuff. And when you get into these home environments, now security teams, and I'd love to hear about this from the panel, is, you're now kind of taking on users' home networks as well, right? You've got kids with computers, you've got different IoT devices, you've got all this stuff that's on their networks, and there's ways to go about protecting those workstations. But those, I think, have been somewhat problematic for folks, but it's a lot of the same, right? It's email phishing, it's ransomware, and some of the types of attack vectors I don't think have traditionally changed very much, but there's been much more frequency and kind of amplification of what organizations are seeing, what we're seeing, and the intentions are a bit different, meaning what the adversarial aspect of compromise is trying to achieve. So I think, now we saw some reports coming out earlier this week from the federal government about certain types of compromises and that have been occurring in certain industries. I wonder, though, how much more of that there is, right? So if I think about it from a nation state perspective, where we were at earlier this year, World War III and, whatever kind of hyperbole was around that, how would a foreign nation impact our country right now? And those are the types of things that I think about and worry somewhat, because right now we're more vulnerable than ever. And while those traditional attacks are still occurring, what non-traditional attacks are we not yet seeing?
And we're not done. I mean, we're still in the thick of it with a fairly long, people describe the path out of this being more like a Nike swoosh, the economy looking like that too. I spent the last 10 years in financial services and payments before joining Dewpoint a short time ago. And there's a somewhat often cited statement that the famous bank robber, Willie Sutton, they asked him, "So Willie, why do you rob banks?" And the answer was, "Well, that's where the money is." So with that, Mark, keeping the money flowing and protecting the money. And I would also bet that there's been a lot of increased activity as stimulus insight and access to stimulus dollars has been a feature of this experience. Can you speak to what that's been like for you and your team?
Yeah, definitely keeping the money flowing. We've had a couple of different experiences on that front. When everything really kind of started hitting right away and leading up to when the first stay-at-home order was issued, a lot of the branches were reporting increase to cash withdrawals, and a lot of members were coming in withdrawing large sums of cash, and so we were starting to worry for a minute that there was going to be a big run on cash, and that only lasted for a couple of days before that subsided. After that, the online services have seen an uptick, especially when the stimulus came through. Our online banking channels saw a significant increase in activity during that period. We had a couple of days where the amount of logins more than doubled what our previous high water mark was, and was taxing our systems. We ended up and had to add capacity on the fly to handle the workload. Also, this has put a strain on the rest of our staffs, our lending staff in particular, because with people not having jobs, they can't make their payments. And so we've had a lot of our loan officers working with the membership to do loan deferments and restructure payments so that they can stay afloat during this time. And then on, of course, the Paycheck Protection Program that went through, that has also caused lots of activity, and the laws and regulations on, I should say, the rules on that have been changing constantly as it's come out. So that's been a real struggle. We've been having to try to maintain all of these services and help all of the members through this whole process, because while our lives weren't necessarily disrupted, theirs have been significantly disrupted. They don't know, how long they're going to be at home and whether or not they're going to get a paycheck anytime soon. So that's been a struggle from our standpoint, is just to make sure that we're helping everybody as much as we can.
So financial services becomes a somewhat obvious target area. Dave, an insurance company isn't exactly the first place I would think of if I'm an attacker that I'm going to exploit in this time. Have you seen any change from an attack standpoint, from a exploitation perspective?
It's really been fairly consistent as far as the types of attacks. Lots of phishing, whatnot. But along the lines of what Scott mentioned earlier, amplified. We're definitely seeing an uptick in those. But it's pretty much the same old. People trying to phish our users, phish our executives, hoping to get their hands on customer PII type information that they could use for their own benefits. So that it's fairly consistent. What we have done because of the uptick, though, is we've ramped up on the security awareness training that we're delivering. The frequency, the targeting specific topics to help people as they work from home, those types of things.
Okay. And Trent, how about you? Scott was mentioning he's anxious to know what the experience has been for the rest of the panel. It would be frankly unthinkable for many of us that somebody would try to interfere with the healthcare providers and the first responders. But have you been seeing increased activity?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are people out there that do target healthcare, and actually we're one of the larger targets for ransomware and stuff. Obviously, we have a lot of personal information that you can't easily change. To Scott's point, we're seeing the methods be similar. It's just very COVID specific related. So we're seeing, like others, a lot of phishing, a lot of targeted phishing. We have seen some challenges where people are spoofing us, because obviously in a COVID environment, something come from the hospital, would be something somebody would be more likely to click on. So it's not necessarily security of our network, but security of the community based on somebody trying to impersonate us. The other thing that we're seeing as a challenge is with the remote, moving to the remote, a lot more of that security is dependent on the endpoint. And so we don't have the same amount of visibility or the same amount of tools to be able to prevent and respond to certain types of incidents. So similar to Dave, we've been spending a lot of time on trying to raise that awareness. We are also looking at more tools to be able to do remote management. You can imagine things just as simple as patch management. When you don't have a large remote population or everybody's usually on site at least once or twice a week, it's easier to patch those systems. But now as you have systems that are off network for weeks on end, how do we manage those and get more timely with the patching? Along with that, how do we support it as we're trying to bring those systems back up? Part of the challenge as well is that monitoring piece, being able to alert and notify. We have a lot more dependency on our endpoint security solutions, but we still, as Scott mentioned earlier, have or Paul, you might have, we're very dependent on that local network and that environment. And so we don't have the same tools and capabilities for that remote staff. Add on to that the additional targeting based on the COVID environment, and you're set up for more incidents to try and respond to.
I want to stay on the technology for a minute before making two more transitions and then wrapping things up. Has there been a specific technology that has carried more water for you that you have really come to say that's the darling? It's given us more than we thought, or everything we've needed. On the flip side, is there something that you've found from a technology standpoint that has been more strained than others? And I'll go back to you, Trent, with that, and then we'll go to Dave and Mark.
Yeah, I'd say definitely there's not anything we've seen as a panacea that, hey, this solves everything. And obviously, even before this occurred, you didn't really have that. I would say some of the things that have been challenging, kind of as I mentioned, is more the patch management, the monitoring, those types of pieces. Some of the tools that we've found very good value in are endpoint management tools. We have seen an increased usage, being able to leverage some DLP. Actually, many of our vendors have been very positive at giving us pilots to implement new tools and technology. So a good example, one that is being piloted that's been very helpful for us is Umbrella with Cisco for those remote users. So I wouldn't say that there's one tool that we feel makes everything great, but we are starting to leverage tools in different ways and leverage new tools. One of the things that for us that was a challenge is we use Absolute for being able to remote wipe devices and that type of thing. Well, that's mainly set up on our laptop environments. As we start to have larger groups going remote, we've had to then roll that out, for example, to our desktops that people are using for like our call centers and those types of things. So what we're finding is using our existing tools in new ways, as well as adding on some tools to be able to better respond.
Thank you. And Dave, how about you? I have a theory as to how you're going to answer this, but what's been best for you?
Our VDI environment, our virtual desktop environment, it definitely saved the day for us. Really, the only thing we had to do to it to ramp it up was we had a few extra blades that we had to add to give us some more computing resources to handle the additional load. Fortunately, we had those laying around in the data center. They were intended to be used in our server environment, but we just quickly took them out of the box and repurposed them. So that saved the day for us. As far as things that could have gone better or whatnot, or technology-wise, I would have to say it's along the lines of what Trent said, patching. We're right now working through that. How do we support all these devices now out in the wild The majority used to be within our four walls. How do we continue to support those and provide patching and software installation and whatnot when they're still spread around? One other thing along with what Trent said is before we relied heavily on our in-house URL filtering, firewalls, whatnot, and now we had agents on our machines for tracking as far as threats and whatnot, but we really didn't have that level of enforcement. And so we also have ramped up on Umbrella now to help with these users to give us the same level of controls and visibility.
Great, thank you. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, and very similar to what Dave was saying there. The savior was for us being able to get the remote desktops going so that the endpoints didn't have to be completely configured, and that was really the savior for us from that perspective. As far as challenges go, kind of the same thing Dave and Trent said, that patching and that's a big concern, is trying to keep those up to date, because those devices aren't coming back on site with the regularity that they were before. And I guess one of the things that keeps me up at night, like we've been talking about, is we've got all of these unsecure networks basically that we have opened up some exposure to, and trying to find ways to get some more security around those and comfort level. That's probably one of the biggest things that keeps me up at night right now that we're working through.
Thank you. Rather than lateral over to you next, Scott, I'm in the interest of time, we've only got 15 minutes remaining, and I really want to get to that next phase. What's coming? I want to talk about the positives from this, the impact that this experience has had on your role, your function, what your organization, how they've responded to you, and how you see the future looking. And I'm going to begin with you, Dave. What has the organization's view of IT been like in this experience?
Oh, it's been nothing but positive. Nothing but positive. I think they realized quickly that we were far more prepared than they ever thought, and that we ever thought. Such to the degree that, as I mentioned, we had a limited work from home program in place previously, but now, because they've seen how well this has gone, it's dispelled any doubts that our family of companies ever had around, managing a significantly sized remote workforce. That we are now moving in the direction that large swaths of the company will likely remain work from home even when this is all over. Going forward, I see us, continuing to tweak our technologies and whatnot to help us live in this new world, but a lot of emphasis being put on focusing on improving our skills around managing a remote workforce, encouraging our employees to stay connected, utilizing available tools to communicate like they always have. Because now, even though we're miles apart, instead of just across an aisle, we have to still have that human element involved. So finding ways to communicate and stay in touch, I think that's going to be the focus for us.
Thank you. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, so we had a good response at our organization as far as what they think of IT. Everybody was very positive and appreciative of what we were doing. I think recognized that we were being put under the gun there, and I think we also learned that we were far more prepared than we probably thought we were. If you would have asked me at the beginning of the year if we would be able to take half the credit union and send it off site with a week's notice, I would have said, yeah, you're crazy. But we found that we were much more prepared for that than we were. And I think through this whole process too, this has really shown everybody that it is possible to work remote. Not everybody needs to be in the same office. And, some of the departments had to figure out ways to accomplish their work without being right next to each other. And they found that they could do that. And so Going forward, I really do think that this is going to be more the new norm, where we're going to have employees off site consistently. I don't think everybody is going to come back on site. And we are going to need to ramp up our remote workforce management ability and try to work on how we're going to get that collaboration. And like Dave was saying, there's a certain amount of personal interaction that gets lost when everybody is remote, and that's going to be a little bit of a challenge. But it seems to me like that is going to be the new norm, and I think ultimately it will be good, and everybody will adjust to it.
Wonderful. Trent, how would you answer that?
Yeah, very similar to the other panelists. Definitely IT was seen as an enabler. We were able to implement many things very quickly, as the others have mentioned, probably quicker than we thought that we would be able to. In addition to just not the remote working, but also from a healthcare standpoint, a huge increase in telemedicine. So not only with our caregivers, but with our patients as well in that interaction. And so you can imagine, as people tried to not go into the doctor's office, but still wanting to be able to interact with the doctor. I think similarly for going forward, I do think there's going to be more of a new norm. Obviously, there's not going to be anything soon that will change. Even as we start to have people come back in the office, there's still going to be social distancing and the other pieces with it. I do think we will also see a larger presence of remote workers. What that will be in the long term is still kind of being worked out, but it would definitely be broader than we currently or had prior to the COVID environment. Similarly with our telemedicine pieces, I think you will start to see more patient acceptance of technology as they want to visit with their doctor, not just from the healthcare employee side, but also from the community. They've started to accept a lot more of technology and being able to leverage it for different things. Similar to Dave, one of our pieces that we're really focusing on right now is the engagement piece. We actually do see where IT or technology may have a role in improving that overall technology or that engagement. And so we're hoping to be able to do that going forward as well.
Thanks, Trent. Scott, what are you hearing from the cross-section of customers that you're talking to? Are they able to pick their heads up now? Are they starting to look forward and start to think about what we will come to think of as normal after the pandemic starts to recede?
Yeah, so the way that I would probably best answer and describe that question is organizations that I've been talking to have really been focused on taking the lessons they've learned from all of the experiences that Trent, Dave, and Mark have talked about, right? I mean, these massive uplifts and technology implementations and, just to facilitate the workforce, everybody's kind of done things in a very, we got to get it done right now mode and method. The conversations that I think are starting to happen now for a lot of organizations are around, all right, well, what did we learn from this? How did we adjust? How did we adapt? How did we take advantage of the capabilities that we have in ways that we hadn't anticipated them? Just exactly like what we've been talking about. But now that conversation is pivoting to, all right, what are we going to do moving forward? What about the next time we have a situation where maybe we don't have a full complement of workers in our offices, but we need to work remote, or we have a natural disaster, or we have some type of a situation that occurs again, and we need to pivot back to this. What have we learned from this, and what are we going to do moving forward? How are we going to take our business applications that have traditionally been within our own data centers, and we're going to put them online? We're going to move them over into a SaaS-based model, or how are we going to take some of our infrastructure and push it up into AWS or Azure? How are we going to take more advantage of, whether it's Google Suite or Office 365 is obviously more common. How are we going to take more advantage of that and make that from a worker productivity perspective and tool set vantage point? How are we going to make those tools kind of more widely adopted within our organization? And then how are we going to address the new risks that we have as a result of all of these situations and all of these business changes that are happening so rapidly. For a long time, we've worked in different ways to implement cloud services and implement different types of SaaS and infrastructure as a service-based approaches. Now organizations are starting to really ramp up in those areas and starting to deal head on with a lot of the new risks that are associated with it. So, that's I think probably one of the fundamental things that I'm having conversations with organizations about, is just like, what is that business continuity strategy moving forward? How are you adapting? How are you adjusting? And what have you learned from this that you're going to apply to your go forward plans?
Great, thank you. We have a limited amount of time left, and I want to I want to remind attendees and remember to give the audience a chance to ask any questions. I do have a final question in mind if we don't see any questions come in from the audience. And I'm not seeing anything. So staying on this vein of the next, okay, my question to each of you is, how are you going to think about your role and your organization differently as a result of this experience and the way you're going to approach business? And there's sort of three themes to this. It's the technologies that you guys use, the people you have on your team, and the partnership and relationships that have helped you get through this. And Trent, you really did a nice job of talking about how you leaned on partners and vendors and took a more collaborative approach. Is that likely to be more the way you'll approach things going forward? So with you first, Trent.
Sure. Definitely a collaborative is definitely where we need to be moving forward. We're dependent on all of our business associates and partners. And so the weakest link is an impact on all of us. So from our standpoint, definitely collaborative, not that we weren't before, but even more so now as they're running into the same challenges we are with a remote workforce. So working with that. I also think kind of back to the other part of being an enabler, being able to enable the organization to move to the next level, to be able to provide those services and opportunities for others.
Great, thank you. Dave, over to you.
100% what Trent just said. Looking for ways to enable people to collaborate better in a secure fashion, promoting that, using this technology to bring people together and find new ways to survive in this new world. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay, and Mark?
Yeah, I don't know that things will necessarily change too much in the way we in IT approach things. We always have looked at ourselves as being the enablers and try to work collaboratively. I see us as becoming even more so the glue and the foundation that holds everything together. And I think we're going to see where the business units start coming to us even more as they start trying to operate more digitally than they do now. So I think our role will become a little more ingrained in what the business units are actually doing, as opposed to maybe being sort of on the side just when they feel like they need us.
Great, thank you. We do have two questions from the audience, and then we'll take those two questions and then go to a closing comment from each panelist. The first question is, everyone mentioned the importance of employees continuing to build relationships. How are they collaborating, and what tools are in play to facilitate, support, or extend that? Mark, you first.
I can jump in here real quick. Pretty much the way we've been handling that is a lot of conference calls and trying to have regularly established meetings so that people have a chance to come together and talk as a group. And so using whether it's your phone conferencing or WebEx, which we've utilized quite heavily, Those have been helpful, and trying to make sure that everybody then has a voice so that you can keep those virtual teams going. The other piece is tools like Slack. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, instant messaging. We use that quite heavily through this, more so than ever, as well as like Sketchboard for whiteboarding and collaboration. So we've used tools like that to try to sort of replicate what you would have if you were sitting in an office or in a conference room.
Got it. Okay, Trent, how about you?
Yeah, I would say similarly, the teleconferencing WebEx, for example, has been a tool leveraged by many. It's very exciting to see how the businesses actually engage those tools and how they're starting to use them in different ways. Similar to this, having actual panels, be able to have people ask questions in that. But the other thing that we are seeing is, in some cases, people are setting up social gatherings for staff that aren't just work related. So it's kind of like a WebEx happy hour where people can kind of talk about something different, something outside of work, be able to collaborate, but that's trying to just continue to build that bond between people and that engagement, and make sure that we're thinking of the people side of it as well. Similarly, that to us has probably been the most used tool. Obviously, all of us had too many meetings to begin with before this occurred, but the WebEx has been a way to continue those that are most critical and still keep that social piece. One of the things we do appreciate with that as well is the visual side of it. So it's not just a conference call. You can see faces, you can see reactions. It keeps it personal more. So,
Indeed. Dave?
For us, Microsoft Teams. We were a user before this, but looking at stats, it was primarily used for chat. Early on, we started emphasizing, hey, turn that camera on when you're in meetings, and people have slowly moved into that world. I'm not so sure they loved that idea at first, but now it's become second nature. So we're seeing a lot more people utilizing that. If you look at our records within the system, it's amazing over the last month how it just went from being a trickle of users using cameras to across the board. And then what Trent mentioned about the whole personal aspect of it, having the virtual happy hours. I actually have one of those with my team later this afternoon. I think that's a huge element, keeping that whole personal touch in place.
Yeah, we as well. I've been incredibly impressed by the leadership and the human resources and how they've kept the human side of this and prioritized it. I think there's some really cool things that are going to come and survive from a result of this. And I think we touched on it. I'm going to give one last chance around the horn, but the question was any specific apps or technologies that are really leveraging the work from home. You can either speak to that or just share your overall observation and how you want to think about things as we're coming out of COVID. So I'm going to give you the first opportunity, Mark.
Well, there's probably not any specific apps in general. Our setup is fairly simplistic, but it works. So, with the general VPN, we use Cisco products, and then of course the RDP, so that they can get into a desktop that they're used to seeing when they're on site. That's pretty much what we're leveraging.
Great. Any other closing comments, Mark?
I guess probably the one thing through this that I have that I would take away or kind of throw out there for everybody is when you have situations where there's a lot of uncertainty and fear, controlling the panic is a big factor. And I think having plans and good leadership to where people know what their roles and responsibilities are goes a long ways towards helping to achieve your goals and keep things moving forward so that things don't really fall apart. Because I think that was one of the reasons why we were able to accomplish what we were, was because we did have plans in place, and We had roles assigned and people knew what was expected of them, and were able to just focus on processes. And because there were times when you could kind of start seeing the panic wanting to set in, and managing that was a big part of this. So that's definitely something you want to keep control of.
Thanks, Mark. Dave, over to you.
For us, I mean, not to sound like a broken record, but once again, VMware Horizon View, Office 365, those tools saved the day for us. So technology-wise, I mean, that was the be-all end-all for us. And I think, you know, as we go forward, and I think it's very important to have a plan in place. Technology is great, but more importantly is having a plan in place around incident response, business continuity, disaster recovery, and knowing and having it published who the key players are for each of those. And so that they're aware of what their responsibilities are, and everyone knows who to contact. And then routinely performing tabletop exercises around those to keep everybody fresh and look for gaps that may have occurred as things have changed.
Thanks, Dave. Trent?
Yeah, I mean, very similar from an app standpoint. We mentioned the WebEx or the video conferencing tools, as well as for us, VDI has been an important part of that as well. As far as last comments, the one thing that I would kind of say that I've observed is it still does come down to people and how much people have responded. So even within the IT side, you know, people are willing to step up when there's a problem. People jump in to solve it. And while technology is enabling it, it's the response of the people getting together and responding to a crisis overall that's been very impressive.
Thanks, Trent. Scott, I'm going to give you the final words.
Oh, I appreciate that. The only thing that I would just want to really stress is everybody is struggling a lot with this in different ways. One of the things that I just really want to make sure I overemphasize is when you have a conversation with somebody, ask them how they're doing. When you first interact with them in the morning, tell them good morning. Just really basic concepts that we do and follow when we're in front of each other in an office. We need to keep doing those things. We need to stay in touch with folks. We need to sit there and maybe spend the first 5 minutes of a one-on-one just checking in with each other. How's your family doing? How are your kids? How are you adjusting to teaching them from home? How are they adjusting to that? Just that human element, that closeness, that consideration and care is so important right now over anything else. Business is going to be there. We're going to keep pushing hard and doing all the things we need to, but having that conversation and just staying in touch with everybody is so important right now.
That's great. Thanks, Scott. I want to emphasize that, and I want to thank our panelists. This has been fantastic. You've all spoken from the heart. You've spoken directly from your experience, very conversational. And as Scott was saying, I can personally speak from experience. Adversity sometimes forms the deepest, the strongest, most important bonds. And I would say through this process, we've had extraordinary relationships with our customers. Thank you all for coming and supporting Rapid7 and Dewpoint in providing this window into peer perspectives. And then also partnerships. Rapid7 has been an extraordinary partner. We always try to take our approach to business about people first and meeting business needs and solving problems. So thank you. Looking forward to getting together with all of you in person sometime, hopefully soon. And have a wonderful, safe, great day. Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody.
You're welcome. With that, we're going to conclude today's session. As I said, the recording will be provided to those that registered and attended, and we'll be following up with you in short order. Thanks, everyone.